tonight is a very special moment, an important kind of turning point, because it marks one of the stages in the long path to changing the way people think about the Tibet question. 35 years ago, the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party began an effort in Tibet and really throughout China to eradicate any kind of distinctive cultural traditions. The project that we all know as the Cultural Revolution. And one of the perhaps biggest mistakes, or biggest misunderstandings that happened in the world of Tibet studies and Tibet political activism, and in the world in general, was the expectation that that Cultural Revolution, that campaign would be successful. The assumption that it had succeeded in wiping out distinctive Tibetan culture. It was only in the 1980s, 15 to 20 years after it had begun, that we began to discover that that effort, the Cultural Revolution, despite the huge damage, the unimaginable suffering that it had caused, had failed. Culture was not only alive in Tibet, but it was thriving, and it was emerging not as a reconstruction of the past, but as a new culture constantly evolving, mixing tradition with new ideas, mixing the old with the modern, creating new forms of what it means to be Tibetan. It took years for people outside to realize that the Tibet issue was not an issue of a culture outside Tibet being preserved and sent back to Tibet, but the issue of a new and emerging culture inside Tibet, coming out of the shadows, being dug up from where it had been hidden for all those painful years, an issue that needs support, that needs sustaining power and help from outside. So gradually the big story of the Tibet issue, I think, in the last 30 years has been the realization that the real core of this issue is inside Tibet, with those people who are rebuilding their culture after the damage that has been done to it. They've been doing that against enormous odds, of course. They're not facing a threat to eliminate culture, as we can see. What we see now is that there's a hugely thriving industry of cultural production inside Tibet. But there is also an industry of party officials trying to limit that culture, trying to constrict it, trying to cut off parts of it they don't like. And one of the key points of the party's effort to redefine and restrict Tibetan culture in Tibet, it's never been to eliminate it, it's been to shape it into a form they like. And the key statement about this was made in July 1997, actually the day that Hong Kong reverted to the motherland. At that day, a big rally in Lhasa, in that big grand Potala square that had been built 2 years earlier, the party secretary of Tibet at that time, Chen Guiyan, gave a famous and infamous speech in which he talked about the correct Tibetan music, what should be, what must be, the model Tibetan song. And he said, the model Tibetan song is the song of the washerwoman and the PLA soldier. And that song, famous song for Chinese revolutionary people of the revolutionary generation, is a song about a PLA soldier who arrives in Tibet and he sees a Tibetan woman, a young woman, washing clothes beside a river, and he goes to help her. It's a completely traditional socialist idea of the army helping the people. As they say in socialist literature, it's about the army and the people being like lips and teeth. And this, in 1997, nearly 50 years after the revolution, Chen Guiyan and the Communist Party tried to promote this as the ideal of Tibetan music in late 1990s Tibet. You can't imagine a more powerful way of losing one's support. You can't imagine a better illustration of how far removed party leaders are, or were, probably still are in Tibet, from Tibetan people. And that kind of speech was a sort of turning point, I think, for Tibetan artists and musicians. And this accelerated the development of music in Tibet that is a kind of autonomous art, an art that is not listening to stories about the PLA and the washerwoman an art that does not follow the dictates of the party. That art, of course, became important because it could be distributed in ways the party can't control. Not so much by internet, that wasn't really so present then, but by cassettes, cassette tapes, and later by CDs, and nowadays by DVDs. In the markets in Lhasa, from the mid-1990s onwards, you could buy hundreds and hundreds of cassette tapes, and later VCDs, and now DVDs. There were always the ones that were officially approved, and then there would be unmarked ones. Now, this kind of music, the outspoken political song, is very, very unusual. There's been a huge acceleration in the emergence of that kind of music since the protests of 2008. After 2008, especially in Amdo, Tibetan intellectuals and artists have decided to speak out directly. But until 2008, that was not the case. Almost no music or art was explicitly political, with one important exception, which many of you will remember, the song of the Drapshi nuns. That was the first distributed openly political song. And even then, it was beautifully poetic, lyrical and evocative. There's a very famous story I was told by someone who was there at the time, who actually saw Jiang Zemin once ask a famous Tibetan singer in a private room to sing him a Tibetan song, and the singer sang the White Choten, understood by all Tibetans as a lament for the Dalai Lama. He sang it in front of Jiang Zemin, and the only person who knew that meaning of it was another Tibetan official who was in the room, Rakti. But he couldn't stop it because he didn't want to reveal what was happening. That's an important example for us of the real power of ambiguity. The power for Tibetans inside Tibet is the power of the weak, the power to make the authorities uncertain of their feelings, their ideas and their meanings. The power to make the Chinese leadership never sure, never confident if they have won over Tibetans or